The Pressure Campaign: How Washington Expected Ottawa to Follow Them into Vietnam. When the United States began its deepening commitment to Vietnam in the early 1960s, the Canadian government found itself trapped in the gravitational pull of a geopolitical crisis it had not created, did not support, and could not easily avoid. Canada, unlike Australia or South Korea, did not possess a tradition of following the United States into foreign conflicts as a matter of doctrine. Its military deployments had always been shaped by multilateral legitimacy. League of Nations missions, United Nations operations, NATO commitments. Vietnam offered none of these frameworks. Yet despite this, Washington viewed Canada as a natural partner, a fellow Western democracy with a shared Cold War worldview, a strong continental alliance through NORAD, and a political leadership that had long positioned itself as a responsible actor within the Western Bloc. For the White House, it seemed self-evident that Canada would support the American venture, whether materially or politically. Behind the scenes, however, the dynamics were far more complicated. Canada, in the early 1960s, was navigating a delicate diplomatic and strategic position. On one side was the United States, the dominant power of the Western Hemisphere and Canada's indispensable economic partner. On the other side was a rising global skepticism toward the escalating conflicts of the Cold War, particularly those involving insurgencies in the decolonizing world. Canadian leaders understood that aligning too closely with Washington could damage their credibility as mediators in international disputes, a role that Canada had cultivated meticulously since the Suez Crisis. The very foundations of modern Canadian foreign policy, peacekeeping, multilateralism, negotiation, were in tension with the American narrative of communist containment through military force. The election of Lyndon B. Pearson in 1963 intensified this dilemma. Pearson had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis, and he had built a political career on the principle that international conflict required diplomatic, not military, solutions. His worldview clashed fundamentally with the logic of Vietnam. He saw the conflict not as an external aggression orchestrated by Moscow or Beijing, but as a complex civil war rooted in nationalism, post-colonial fragmentation, and internal political collapse. Pearson's skepticism was reinforced by Canadian diplomats stationed in Asia who consistently reported that Washington's interpretation of the war relied more on ideological assumptions than on local realities. Yet Pearson inherited structures that made outright opposition risky. Canada's economic dependence on the United States was enormous. 70% of exports went south across the border. National defense was tightly integrated with American strategic systems through the Permanent Joint Board on Defense and NORAD. Pearson also understood the psychology of Washington policymakers. Dissent from a close ally would be interpreted not merely as disagreement, but as betrayal. This tension defined the earliest phase of Canada's Vietnam dilemma. The question was not simply whether Canada supported the war, but whether Canada could afford to oppose it. Complicating matters further was Canada's membership in the International Control Commission (ICC), the body created by the 1954 Geneva Accords to monitor the ceasefire in Vietnam. Canada, India, and Poland formed the Three-Nation Commission, with Canada representing the Western Bloc. This placed Ottawa in the uncomfortable position of being both an observer and a participant in the machinery of the conflict. American officials expected Canada to shape ICC reports in ways favorable to U.S. policy, especially by documenting violations by North Vietnam while downplaying those by the South. Pearson understood that politicizing the ICC would destroy its credibility, but he also recognized that refusing to comply would trigger American anger. The ICC thus became a battleground where Canada's desire for neutrality collided with Washington's expectations of alignment. As U.S. involvement escalated after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, pressure on Ottawa intensified. Internal American memoranda indicate that Washington saw Canadian participation, however symbolic, as essential for legitimizing the conflict. Even a small deployment of engineers, medics, or observers would allow the U.S. to claim international support. Meanwhile, senior American diplomats privately suggested that Canada owed the United States cooperation due to decades of continental defense collaboration. The White House framed Vietnam not merely as a regional conflict, but as a global test of resolve, implying that allies had an obligation to support American leadership. Pearson and his advisors recognized the underlying truth. Washington did not require Canadian troops. It required Canadian endorsement. A political ally, even a reluctant one, could be leveraged as evidence of international consensus. The Canadian government therefore faced a challenge that could not be resolved through military calculus alone. The decision was entangled with national identity, economic vulnerability, alliance politics, and the legacy of peacekeeping. Pearson's reluctance emerged not from anti-American sentiment, but from a conviction that participation would compromise Canada's global role while offering no strategic benefit. Despite this, Canada's neutrality was not absolute. The country's economy benefited significantly from defense industrial integration, and Canadian companies sold equipment to U.S. forces, from ammunition to specialized components, facilitating a form of indirect support. American policymakers pointed to these contributions as evidence that Canada was quietly participating while avoiding political accountability. Pearson's critics in Washington argued that Canada was benefiting economically from the war, while refusing to endorse it politically. For Pearson, such accusations were provocative but not fully unjustified, and they reinforced the complexity of maintaining a principled stance in a deeply asymmetrical relationship. The internal debate within Ottawa was equally fraught. Some senior officials argued that opposing the United States openly could damage the bilateral relationship irreparably. Others contended that silence would implicitly endorse American escalation. Pearson found himself balancing the need to preserve Canadian sovereignty with the necessity of avoiding open confrontation. He believed that Canada could neither fully support the war nor fully reject its ally, a position that required diplomatic agility bordering on contradiction. By 1965, the gap between Washington's expectations and Ottawa's convictions had widened sharply. President Johnson, whose personality and leadership style differed dramatically from Kennedy's, viewed dissent from allies as disloyalty. Johnson believed deeply in the morality of the American mission in Vietnam and considered global support essential for maintaining domestic momentum. When Canada hesitated, he interpreted Pearson's caution not as neutrality, but as obstruction. The U.S. administration began pressuring Canada more aggressively through diplomatic channels, through NORAD consultations, and through back-channel communications, suggesting that Canada's reliability as an ally was at stake. This set the stage for one of the most intense periods of U.S. that Canadian diplomatic friction in the post-war era. Pearson recognized that silence was becoming untenable. The more the United States escalated militarily, the more Canada was expected to respond. Pearson faced a dilemma. Speaking out risked provoking Washington, while remaining quiet risked compromising Canada's identity as a peacekeeping nation. The external pressures intensified at the same moment that internal pressures mounted, as Canadian public opinion increasingly questioned the logic of the war and the credibility of American claims. The first part of this story ends with Canada caught in a tightening vice between an ally demanding loyalty and a national ethos rejecting military entanglement. The next phase, Washington's direct confrontation with Ottawa, Pearson's Toronto speech, and Johnson's explosive reaction, would reveal why Canada came closer to joining the war than the public ever realized, and why Pearson ultimately chose to say no. The confrontation, when Washington tried to pull Canada into Vietnam. By 1965, the divergence between American escalation in Southeast Asia and Canada's cautious neutrality had transformed from a background tension into a central fracture in North American diplomacy. Washington, frustrated by growing international criticism and aware that its Southeast Asian commitment lacked the broad legitimacy that had accompanied earlier Cold War efforts, turned to its closest allies for political cover. Canada, historically reliable and widely respected as a middle power mediator, became the focus of this effort. From the perspective of the Johnson administration, Canadian support, military, political, or even symbolic, could counter the narrative that Vietnam was an American war fought in isolation. For Ottawa, however, such support threatened to undermine decades of foreign policy identity. As U.S. troop levels surged into the hundreds of thousands, the White House began to intensify its pressure on Ottawa. Diplomatic cables from the period show increasingly pointed language. Washington expected Canada to acknowledge the legitimacy of American intervention, to frame the conflict as a necessary stand against communist expansion, and, at minimum, to avoid public criticism. In internal discussions, U.S. officials expressed frustration that Canada's public neutrality gave ammunition to critics abroad. While London reluctantly supported American policy, Ottawa refused to align itself automatically with Washington's interpretation of the conflict. Johnson's advisors viewed this as an unacceptable divergence from Allied unity. The tension between the two countries grew sharper as Pearson attempted to maintain a balancing posture. He continued to emphasize diplomacy, negotiations, and multilateral solutions. Yet every statement he made was scrutinized by Washington for signs of disloyalty. The White House believed Pearson's language implicitly challenged the American narrative, undermining U.S. credibility. Pearson believed that unquestioning support would compromise Canada's independent voice and destroy the foundation of its peacekeeping reputation. The President and the Prime Minister were locked into fundamentally incompatible expectations. By early 1965, the United States sought to leverage bilateral defense structures to pressure Canada. NORAD meetings became platforms for American officials to remind their Canadian counterparts of the shared interests of continental security. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats warned that Canada's unwillingness to support Vietnam could weaken the political basis of defense cooperation. This was a subtle but powerful threat. Canada depended heavily on U.S. defense infrastructure and knew that damaging the partnership would have consequences far beyond Southeast Asia. Yet Pearson, aware of the implications, still believed that national interest required resisting American pressure. At the same time, the International Control Commission (ICC), the structure created to oversee the Geneva Accords, played a significant role in amplifying the crisis between the two nations. Washington expected the ICC to provide consistent documentation of North Vietnamese violations, thereby validating American claims. Ottawa, however, insisted that the ICC remain as objective as possible. Canadian representatives on the commission were placed in an almost impossible position, pressured by Washington to condemn Hanoi, pressured by India to maintain neutrality, and constrained by Polish obstructionism as a Soviet bloc partner. Washington interpreted Canada's reluctance as ideological deviation rather than procedural integrity. American officials increasingly believed that Canada should serve as an instrument for American policy within the ICC. Pearson, however, feared that compromising the Commission would destroy its remaining credibility. But restraining Canadian representatives deepened U.S. impatience. For Ottawa, maintaining the ICC's neutrality was a matter of principle. For Washington, it was a matter of strategy. By spring 1965, internal U.S. documents reveal that Johnson's advisors were discussing Canada in increasingly blunt terms. Ottawa's reluctance was described as obstructionist, unhelpful, and most damningly, morally ambiguous. To American policymakers, Vietnam was a test of Western resolve. To Canada, it was a conflict whose origins lay in colonialism, nationalism, and great power intervention. The United States saw the war through the lens of communist expansion. Canada saw it through the lens of post-colonial instability. The diplomatic rupture reached its breaking point when Pearson accepted an invitation to speak at Temple University in Philadelphia on April 2, 1965. The speech was intended to reaffirm Canada's commitment to peacekeeping, encourage negotiation in Southeast Asia, and address rising global concern about escalating American bombing campaigns. For Pearson, this was an opportunity to articulate a principled, balanced position without directly confronting the United States. He believed that, as a Nobel laureate and respected figure in diplomatic circles, he could influence the broader debate in a constructive manner. But when Pearson stepped to the podium, the words he delivered were interpreted by Washington as a direct challenge to American policy. He emphasized the need for negotiation, suggested that bombing alone could not secure peace, and implied that escalation risked undermining long-term stability in the region. To Pearson, these statements were carefully measured and rooted in Canadian principles. To Johnson, they were an attack on the moral legitimacy of U.S. policy. The reaction in the White House was immediate and explosive. Johnson, who valued loyalty and feared public criticism, viewed Pearson's speech as an act of betrayal. While he had tolerated cautious statements from allies, he could not accept criticism delivered on American soil. The optics were intolerable. The Prime Minister of one of America's closest allies publicly questioning American policy from a U.S. stage. The President summoned Pearson to Camp David the following day, a rare and symbolic act that underscored the severity of Johnson's anger. The meeting has been recounted in multiple memoirs, and while details vary, the consistent theme is Johnson's profound sense of personal offense. The President confronted Pearson with a level of intensity that shocked Canadian officials. To Johnson, Vietnam was a burden the United States bore on behalf of the free world. Pearson's public criticism suggested that America had lost the moral high ground. Johnson believed he had risked his political future for the war effort. Pearson's speech, delivered in front of an American audience, felt like disloyalty. The Camp David confrontation marked the lowest point in modern U.S. Canadian relations. It exposed the fragility of an alliance often assumed to be unbreakable. It revealed how deeply Vietnam had distorted American expectations of its allies. And it demonstrated that Pearson's commitment to diplomacy would carry significant political cost. After Camp David, pressure on Canada intensified further. American officials privately warned that Canada's stance could jeopardize defense cooperation. Congressional hawks used Canada as an example of Allied weakness. The White House expected Ottawa to become more circumspect in public statements and more supportive in private channels. Pearson, however, remained committed to his position. He understood that bowing to pressure would erode Canada's international role and set a precedent that Ottawa could never escape. Yet even Pearson had to concede that Canada could not confront the United States directly. He refrained from further public criticisms and moderated the government's rhetoric, but he remained firm on the central issue. Canada would not join the Vietnam War. This position was not announced dramatically. It was established through a consistent pattern of decisions, each calibrated to avoid both entrapment and rupture. Part 2 ends at the height of diplomatic crisis, when U.S. that Canadian relations were strained, but Pearson had not yet made the final call. The next phase reveals how Canada came closer than ever to joining the war, not by policy, but by structural entanglement, and why Pearson ultimately rejected every form of participation, even at the cost of Washington's anger. The hidden entanglement, how Canada was pulled toward Vietnam without ever choosing to go. The public confrontation between President Johnson and Prime Minister Pearson in April 1965 is remembered as the defining moment in Canada's refusal to join the Vietnam War. But the geopolitical reality was far more complex. Pearson's stance, though principled, did not immediately free Canada from the gravitational pull of American strategy. Instead, the crisis deepened into a prolonged period of structural entanglement, economic, diplomatic, and military, that brought Canada far closer to Vietnam than most citizens ever knew. For nearly 4 years, Canada stood on the edge of participation, pulled forward by its integration with the American security state and pulled back by its own emerging national identity as a peacekeeping nation. This entanglement had begun long before Vietnam. Since the end of World War II, Canada's defense and intelligence systems had become deeply intertwined with those of the United States. NORAD, created in 1957, integrated air defenses under a binational command structure. U.S. military and intelligence services maintained a constant presence on Canadian soil. Joint planning had become routine. These structures were designed to defend the continent from Soviet attack, not to draw Canada into foreign wars. But once established, they created channels through which American expectations could flow seamlessly into Canadian policy. The deeper the integration, the harder it became for Ottawa to detach itself from the trajectory of U.S. strategy. The Vietnam War intensified this structural dependency. As American involvement grew, the United States increasingly framed the conflict as a test of the Western alliance. Any dissent, particularly from a close ally, appeared as weakness. Canadian officials recognized that opposing the war risked undermining broader cooperation on security issues far more consequential to Canada's direct interests, especially continental defense. The United States controlled early warning systems, nuclear deterrence infrastructure, and the intelligence networks that protected North America. Even if Washington did not explicitly threaten to withhold these capabilities, Canadian policymakers understood that strategic autonomy was limited. This recognition shaped Ottawa's approach during the mid-1960s. The government did not simply reject American requests. It sought to soften the impact of its refusal through quiet, incremental accommodations. Canada increased intelligence sharing with the United States. It expanded military coordination in other theaters to demonstrate reliability. It reassured Washington that refusal to join Vietnam did not reflect a weakening of the broader alliance. These actions were designed to preserve the political foundation of U.S. Canadian cooperation while allowing Ottawa to maintain its distance from Vietnam. Yet each concession deepened the very integration that made neutrality so difficult to sustain. Economic entanglement created another avenue through which Canada was pulled toward the conflict. Canadian industry was heavily tied to the U.S. defense production system. Since the 1956 Defense Production Sharing Agreement, Canadian companies had become suppliers of components, materials, and equipment for the American military. As demand surged with the expansion of the war, Canadian firms increased production dramatically. Although Ottawa did not deploy troops, it participated indirectly through its industrial output. This blurring of economic and military rules created political exposure. Critics argued that Canada was profiting from a war it refused to publicly support. Washington, meanwhile, interpreted Canadian production as a form of de facto participation, convenient for American policymakers, but deeply uncomfortable for Canadian diplomats. The International Control Commission, ICC, created another layer of entanglement. The Commission had originally been conceived as a mechanism to monitor the Geneva Accords, not as a vehicle for managing a full-scale conflict. Yet, as the war escalated, Washington increasingly relied on the ICC to legitimize its claims of North Vietnamese aggression. American officials pressured Canada to produce reports that would portray Hanoi as the primary violator. Pearson resisted this manipulation, but Canada's very presence on the ICC entangled it in the war's political machinery. Ottawa's attempts to maintain neutrality were interpreted by both Washington and Hanoi as tacit alignment with the opposing side. The more Canada tried to remain balanced, the more each bloc viewed it as quietly aiding the other. These structural dynamics were compounded by internal political fractures within Canada. Public opinion, initially muted, became more vocal as images of American bombing campaigns reached Canadian media. Universities became centers of anti-war activism. Churches and civic groups condemned American policy. By 1967, the opposition to Vietnam had evolved into a broader critique of U.S. global leadership. Pearson faced a paradox. The more the Canadian public rejected the war, the more Washington demanded loyalty, and the more the government risked alienating one side or the other. Within Pearson's cabinet, divisions emerged. Some ministers believed Canada needed to maintain its traditional support for U.S. policy. Others argued that Canada should publicly distance itself. A few advocated for a more independent foreign policy that would reflect Canada's growing confidence as a middle power. Pearson had to navigate these fractures carefully. Any internal split would weaken Canada's position internationally and could embolden Washington to increase its pressure. The Prime Minister chose a cautious path, issuing carefully worded statements that emphasized negotiation while avoiding direct condemnation. But despite these careful efforts, Canada's entanglement with U.S. policy continued to draw it closer to Vietnam. Intelligence sharing increased. Military advisors from both nations conducted joint assessments unrelated to Vietnam, but contributing to the appearance of alignment. Canadian diplomats, seeking to maintain dialogue, often found themselves relaying American messages or mediating between Washington and reluctant allies. Even humanitarian efforts, Canada provided medical supplies to Vietnam, became controversial, as both sides interpreted such actions through the lens of the war. Behind closed doors, Pearson recognized the growing danger. Each layer of integration increased the risk that Canada could be drawn into the conflict indirectly. If a major incident threatened U.S. forces or continental security, Washington might expect Canadian military cooperation. If the ICC collapsed under pressure, Canada might be forced to choose between withdrawing or aligning more openly with U.S. claims. If U.S. Canadian relations deteriorated further, the political costs could be severe. Pearson understood that the only sustainable path was to create clear boundaries that would prevent accidental escalation of involvement. Yet establishing boundaries required confronting Washington directly, a prospect Pearson had hoped to avoid. The Prime Minister believed that Canada's relationship with the United States was too important to jeopardize through open conflict. But by late 1966, the Johnson administration's demands began to exceed what Ottawa could accept. Washington wanted Canada to support escalation diplomatically, to endorse the bombing campaigns, and to label North Vietnam as the primary aggressor. These requests were incompatible with Pearson's principles and with Canadian public sentiment. At the same time, Johnson grew increasingly frustrated. The White House viewed Canada's neutrality as hypocrisy, benefiting from American protection while refusing to share the burden of the global struggle. Johnson's inner circle believed Canada was attempting to preserve its international reputation at the expense of U.S. interests. For the president, who interpreted the war as a moral crusade, this was intolerable. American pressure became more direct and more personal. The result was a profound, often invisible crisis in the U.S. Canadian alliance. Canada had not chosen to be drawn into Vietnam, but its structural relationships, economic ties, and diplomatic obligations created a situation where disengagement required deliberate and forceful action. Without such action, Canada risked sliding gradually into alignment through inertia rather than decision. Part 3 ends here, with Canada standing perilously close to the edge of involvement, not through choice, but through the weight of integration with a superpower at war. The final part will explore how Pearson broke this trajectory, the decision that severed the last threads pulling Canada toward Vietnam, and the long-term consequences of saying no to the United States at the height of the Cold War. The decision to say no, how Pearson broke the pull of war and redefined Canadian foreign policy. By the end of 1966, Canada had reached a point of maximum tension in its relationship with the United States. Washington was deep into the most intense phase of the Vietnam War, having committed hundreds of thousands of troops and expanded its bombing campaigns. The Johnson administration demanded not only military and diplomatic support from its allies, but a clear moral endorsement, a recognition that the American mission in Vietnam was both necessary and just. For President Johnson, allies who hesitated appeared suspect. In his worldview, the Western Bloc was engaged in a global struggle whose moral lines were absolute. If Canada, America's closest ally and continental partner, refused to stand alongside the United States, what did that imply about the broader legitimacy of the war? For Pearson, this worldview was both unrealistic and dangerous. He understood that the Vietnam conflict had ceased to be a regional struggle and had transformed into a symbol of American credibility in the Cold War. Because of this transformation, dissent was not merely disagreement. It was perceived as ideological betrayal. Pearson knew that any explicit rejection of American policy would provoke a reaction disproportionate to the immediate issue. Yet he also recognized that the longer Canada remained entangled in the machinery surrounding the war, economically, diplomatically, and institutionally, the harder it would become to avoid eventual alignment. Pearson's challenge was therefore not simply to oppose American policy, but to construct a strategy that would allow Canada to extract itself from the gravitational pull without rupturing the alliance. The Prime Minister was aware that Canada could not afford a full-scale confrontation with the United States. The economic and security consequences would be severe. But failing to draw clear boundaries would put Canada in a position where avoidance became impossible. The risk was that Canada would drift inadvertently into the war through a series of incremental commitments, each justified by cooperation or alliance expectations, until participation became a fait accompli. The turning point came in 1967, when Pearson's government confronted the increasingly untenable contradictions of Canada's position. The ICC, once envisioned as a mechanism for monitoring ceasefires, had become a forum for diplomatic manipulation. American officials pushed the Commission to condemn North Vietnamese actions. Canadian representatives, attempting to maintain neutrality, found themselves accused of bias by both sides. The ICC no longer served Canada's interests. Instead, it entangled Ottawa in the conflict's diplomatic crossfire. Pearson concluded that Canada could no longer remain on the Commission without compromising its credibility. The decision to withdraw from active participation in the ICC was one of the first steps in dismantling the structural ties that bound Canada to the war. At the same time, Pearson directed his government to re-examine Canada's defense production arrangements with the United States. These agreements, originally designed to integrate the defense industries of both nations during the early Cold War, had become deeply problematic. Canadian companies were producing components, materials, and equipment that were being directly used in Vietnam. While Canada had never sent troops, its economy was contributing indirectly to the war effort. Pearson recognized that this undermined the moral foundation of his opposition to the war and risked domestic backlash. But disentangling from these industrial relationships was complicated. The agreements were long-standing, economically beneficial, and central to Canada's integration into North American defense. Pearson chose not to sever the agreements outright. Doing so would trigger economic disruption and provoke a diplomatic crisis, but to tighten export controls and reduce the degree of automatic integration. This subtle maneuver limited Canada's indirect involvement without challenging the broader defense relationship. It signaled to Washington that Canada intended to maintain its distance from Vietnam, even if doing so required friction within the defense production system. Yet these structural adjustments could not resolve the deeper diplomatic conflict. The Johnson administration continued to interpret Canadian neutrality as a failure of Allied responsibility. The more Canada tried to clarify its position, the more Washington perceived hesitation as defiance. The bilateral relationship entered a period of quiet but profound strain. Pearson faced increasing pressure from within his own government to adopt a more assertive foreign policy independent of American influence. The global context reinforced this momentum. As the war dragged on, international opinion turned sharply against U.S. actions. Canada, long respected as an impartial voice, risked its international standing if it remained too closely aligned with Washington. The decisive moment came in late 1967, when Pearson finally concluded that Canada had reached the end of its capacity to maintain ambiguity. The combination of structural entanglements, American pressure, and domestic opposition created a political configuration that could no longer sustain a middle position. The Prime Minister understood that the future of Canadian foreign policy depended on reaffirming its independence. At the same time, he recognized that a direct, confrontational rejection of American policy would be disastrous. The challenge lay in crafting a diplomatic posture that rejected participation without provoking retribution. Pearson's final strategy was subtle but effective. He reframed Canada's opposition not as a judgment of American policy, but as an expression of Canadian national identity. He argued that Canada's global role required a commitment to peacekeeping, diplomacy, and multilateralism. Participation in Vietnam would undermine the credibility Canada had built since the Suez Crisis. He emphasized that Canada's responsibilities in the world were not identical to those of the United States, and that the country's strength lay in its ability to serve as a mediator. This framing allowed Pearson to refuse participation without directly condemning the United States. It also provided a narrative that resonated domestically and internationally. The final step in Pearson's break with U.S. expectations came when his government declined repeated American requests for even symbolic involvement. Washington hoped Canada might send medical teams, training personnel, or observers, small contributions that would provide political cover. Pearson rejected all of them. Each request, no matter how limited, represented a political commitment that could be expanded over time. Pearson understood that symbolic participation was the entry point into deeper alignment. By refusing even minimal involvement, he created a clear line dividing Canada from the war. Behind the scenes, this decision was accompanied by careful diplomatic management. Pearson instructed Canadian embassies to reassure Washington that Canada remained a committed ally in NATO and NORAD. He emphasized that Canada's refusal was based on principle, not on hostility. He sought to prevent the United States from interpreting Canada's stance as a broader rejection of the alliance. These efforts were only partially successful. American frustration persisted. But the alliance endured because Pearson's refusal did not challenge the core structures of UDS, the Canadian cooperation. By the time Pearson left office in 1968, Canada had achieved something unprecedented. It had resisted direct involvement in a major American war while preserving the bilateral relationship. The decision reshaped Canadian foreign policy, strengthening the country's identity as an independent actor with distinct values and priorities. It demonstrated that Canada could maintain partnership with the United States without subordination. And it established a precedent for future governments, providing a framework for navigating asymmetrical power dynamics with the superpower to the south. The long-term consequence of Pearson's refusal was the emergence of a distinctly Canadian approach to international affairs. Over time, this identity became a cornerstone of the nation's global reputation. Canada's neutrality in Vietnam allowed it to participate in diplomatic efforts that might otherwise have been impossible. It strengthened Canada's credibility in international institutions, and it marked a symbolic turning point in the country's evolution from a dominion of the British Empire to an autonomous actor in global politics. Washington, for its part, eventually accepted Canada's position, though not without lingering resentment. By the late 1970s, the Vietnam War had come to be viewed more critically within the United States, and Canada's refusal was often cited as a prescient judgment. The crisis of the mid-1960s revealed the limits of American influence and the capacity of smaller nations to assert independence when guided by clear principles and careful diplomacy. In the end, Canada nearly joined the Vietnam War not through intention, but through the structural ties of alliance, geography, and economics. What prevented its participation was not a single dramatic act, but a sustained effort by Pearson to disentangle Canada from the momentum surrounding American strategy. His refusal was deliberate, strategic, and rooted in an understanding that the national interest required distance from a conflict that offered no benefit to Canada and threatened its global role. By saying no, Pearson preserved Canada's sovereignty, protected its international reputation, and set the foundation for a modern independent foreign policy. His decision remains one of the most consequential acts of leadership in Canadian history, not because it opposed the United States, but because it demonstrated that even the closest allies must sometimes carve their own path.